All right, ready to dive deep into the mind of Alexander Hamilton.
Always up for that.
Today, we're focusing on his take on executive power. And let me tell you, this is a topic that still gets people fired up centuries later.
Oh, absolutely. It's one of those fundamental questions about how a nation should be run. And Hamilton had some pretty strong opinions.
He did. And to really understand them, we got to remember the context, the historical backdrop of a newly formed nation trying to find its footing. So let's set the stage here. What were some of the key challenges facing the United States at that time? What kind of pressures was this fledgling government up against?
Well, imagine emerging from a revolution. Right. You've just overthrown one system of government, but now what? You're starting from scratch with a mountain of debt, no real national currency, and a whole lot of internal divisions.
Not to mention the threat of foreign powers just waiting for you to falter. It was a pretty precarious time, to say the least.
Exactly. And into this volatile mix steps Alexander Hamilton, a man who believed deeply in a strong, energetic executive branch.
And that's where things get really interesting, right? Because his vision for leadership was pretty bold. Some might even say radical for its time. He wasn't afraid to challenge conventional wisdom, to push for a more powerful executive that many people were comfortable with.
It's crucial to understand that Hamilton wasn't advocating for a king or a dictator, even though his critics often accused him of that. What he envisioned was a leader equipped to make tough calls, someone who could act swiftly and decisively in the face of crisis. He believed that kind of leadership was essential for a nation facing such immense challenges.
So it wasn't just about power for power's sake. There was a purpose behind it, a belief that a strong executive was vital for the very survival of the young republic. And this is where his vision clashes dramatically with his political rival, Thomas Jefferson.
Oh, absolutely. Their differences weren't just political, they were philosophical, fundamental disagreements about the very nature of government.
Okay, so let's break down that contrast a bit. How would you characterize Jefferson's stance on executive power? What did he see as the ideal balance of power within a government?
Jefferson was much more wary of concentrated power, particularly at the federal level. He believed deeply in the idea of a decentralized government, one where power was diffused, residing primarily with the states rather than consolidated in a powerful national entity.
So it's less about one being right and the other wrong, and more about two fundamentally different visions for how a nation should be governed.
Precisely. And what's fascinating is that this debate from centuries ago still resonates so strongly in our modern political landscape. The tension between a strong central government and states' rights is still a major point of contention today.
It's like these founding fathers tapped into something fundamental about human nature, about how we organize ourselves and distribute power. And it makes you wonder what experiences shaped Hamilton's thinking. Was this belief in a strong executive purely theoretical? Or was it forged through his own life experiences?
That's a question worth exploring. Hamilton's personal history was anything but ordinary, especially for a founding father. Born out of wedlock on a small Caribbean island, orphaned at a young age, thrust into adulthood far too soon, these experiences undoubtedly molded his worldview and his approach to leadership.
It's like his life was a crash course in the high-stakes game of governance. He witnessed firsthand the chaos and instability that can erupt from weak or ineffective leadership, particularly during his time in the Revolution.
Precisely. His experiences during the war, coupled with his deep understanding of finance, remember, this is the man who essentially built the nation's financial system from the ground up, fueled his desire for a government that could not only maintain order, but also foster economic growth and stability. But it wasn't just about bringing order out of chaos, was it? Hamilton, he had this vision for America to be a major player on the world stage, a force to be reckoned with.
Right, and he believed that to achieve that kind of influence, you needed a government that could make bold moves, and fast. But that idea, a powerful executive, kind of freaked people out back then, didn't it?
Oh yeah, for sure. Think about it, they'd just fought a whole revolution to get rid of a king. The last thing they wanted was another tyrant calling the shots. So Hamilton knew he had to tread carefully here.
So how did he square that circle? How do you convince a nation wary of strong leadership that a strong executive was exactly what they needed?
By going right to the source, the Constitution. He argued that it wasn't some rigid document designed to limit the executive, but rather a blueprint for a dynamic, adaptable government.
And this is where his genius as a political thinker really shines through, isn't it? He understood that the true power of the Constitution lay in its capacity for interpretation, for evolving with the times.
Exactly. He wasn't afraid to dig into the text, to tease out the nuances, to argue for a more expansive view of executive power than many people at the time had considered.
And nowhere is this more evident than in his contributions to the Federalist Papers, right? Those essays were like his grand stage for defending the Constitution and, more specifically, the need for a strong, energetic executive.
Absolutely. Those papers, especially numbers 67 through 77, they were like a masterclass in constitutional law and political strategy. He systematically dismantled the arguments against a strong executive, addressing those fears of tyranny head on.
Like in Federalist number 70, he goes all in on why having multiple executives, which some folks were pushing for, would be a disaster. He uses that phrase, feebleness in the government.
He knew that image of weakness would really land with people who are already worried about the new nation surviving.
Yeah, he's basically saying, look, we're trying to build something strong and lasting here. We can't afford to have a leader who's constantly second-guessing themselves, who's paralyzed by indecision.
He'd seen firsthand during the war how disastrous a divided leadership could be. So for him, unity at the top, even if it meant vesting power in one person, was absolutely essential.
So it's less about one branch of government steamrolling the others,
Yeah.
and more about maintaining a kind of balance where no single entity, not even the executive, can become too dominant.
Exactly. It's like a three-legged stool. You kick one leg out, the whole thing collapses.
All right, so you need all three branches, executive, legislative, judicial, working together, each playing their part, but the executive needs enough juice to actually lead to prevent any one group from grabbing too much power. And this is where Hamilton's concerns about factions comes into play, right? He uses that term a lot in his writings.
Yeah, and for him, factions weren't just political parties or interest groups. They were a threat to the very fabric of the republic.
He saw them as these self-interested groups that could hijack the government, putting their own agendas ahead of the common good.
Exactly. He worried that a weak executive would be vulnerable to those kinds of pressures, leading to bad decisions that could fracture the nation.
So for Hamilton, a strong executive wasn't just about efficiency. It was a safeguard against tyranny of the majority, a way to ensure that the government served the long-term interests of all citizens, not just the loudest or most powerful factions.
Right, and he believed that the president, as the head of state, had a special responsibility to rise above the fray, to think about the big picture, the long game.
Which leads us to a really crucial question. How did Hamilton take these ideas, these big, lofty principles about leadership, and actually put them into practice?
Well, his time as the first Secretary of the Treasury, that was his proving ground.
Right, because it's one thing to talk about a strong executive, but it's another thing entirely to actually be one, to make those tough decisions, to wield that power.
And he certainly wasn't afraid to do that. His battle to establish the first bank of the United States, that's a prime example.
Talk about a controversial move, right?
Yeah.
I mean, here he was proposing a national bank at a time when many people were deeply suspicious of any kind of centralized financial power.
The nation was drowning in debt. The economy was in shambles. There was no national currency. Hamilton knew that something had to be done, and he was willing to use the full force of his position to make it happen.
Even if it meant going head-to-head with some of the most powerful figures in the country.
He was a master strategist, a skilled negotiator, and he understood how to use the levers of power to achieve his goals.
And in the end, he prevailed, didn't he? The first bank was chartered, and it played a huge role in stabilizing the American economy.
A risky move, absolutely, but one that paid off in the long run. And it really cemented Hamilton's legacy as a visionary leader, someone who wasn't afraid to think big and take bold action, even in the face of fierce opposition.
And his fingerprints, they're all over the institutions and systems that define the United States today, aren't they?
Oh, absolutely. The echoes of his ideas about a strong central government, about the role of the executive branch, they're still being debated to this day.
It's remarkable to think that these debates we're having now, they have roots in those early years of the Republic, in the clash of titans like Hamilton and Jefferson.
It just goes to show the enduring power of ideas, how they can shape not only a nation's founding, but also its trajectory over centuries.
It's a reminder that the conversation about power, about the proper role of government in a free society, it's never truly over. Each generation has to grapple with these questions anew, in light of their own unique challenges and circumstances. And as we reflect on Hamilton's legacy, one thing that really stands out is his unwavering belief in the power of leadership, not just as an abstract idea, but as a force for progress, for shaping a nation's destiny. He understood that true leadership requires more than just authority. It demands vision, courage, and an unyielding commitment to the principles that underpin a free and prosperous society. So, as we wrap up this deep dive into Hamilton's bold vision for executive power, we're left with a final, provocative thought. If he could somehow step back into the fray of modern politics, what would he make of the presidency as it exists today? Would he see his vision fulfilled, or would he be dismayed by the ways in which it has been both expanded and constrained? It's a question worth pondering as we continue to grapple with the ever-evolving nature of power in America. And on that note, we want to thank you for joining us on this journey through the intricate mind of Alexander Hamilton. We hope it sparked a deeper understanding of the complexities of executive power and inspired you to keep exploring the enduring questions that lie at the heart of American governance.